Okay, welcome to this week's episode of Interviews with Experts. And this week I'm joined by Nicky Perfect, host of the podcast The Communication Coach, author of her upcoming book on the same subject, which we're going to talk more about. Very exciting. And Nicky is here today to teach us a bit about communication. Her background is as an international, well, I need to get this right, Nicky, international hostage negotiator.
Hostage and crisis negotiator, yeah.
Thank you. So Nicky is here to teach us a bit about communication and the principles that form the foundations of good communication in order to influence and inform. And so particularly relevant to business, especially in the virtual climate we all now live in. Nicky, I love what you do and I find it fascinating. First of all, before we go into the communication side of things in terms of its relevance to kind of the business world and our day-to-day lives, could you tell us a bit about your background as a negotiator, how you got into it, and just a little bit about that, please?
I left the Metropolitan Police in 2018. I had completed 31 years service. I joined as a very young, naive cadet at the age of 18 and then just spent the next 30 years there. And about 20 years into my career, I was on the firearms teams and I was working with a lady who was to become my mentor. So in the rank structure, I was an inspector in charge of the firearms team. She was the superintendent in charge of the unit, so to speak. We were just having a chat and she said, look, have you thought about negotiation, becoming a negotiator? Now, at that time, 2006-07 that we had this conversation, it used to be that you could only become a hostage and crisis negotiator if you were a chief inspector. But they lowered it that year to become an inspector. And I said, well, I can't apply because I'm not at the right rank. And she said, no, they've changed it. Give it a go. I think you'd really enjoy it. I think you'd like it. I think you'd be quite good at it. And because she was a mentor of mine and somebody who I held in high esteem, I thought, well, if she's saying those things, I'll give it a go. And so I started the application. I started to find out more about it. And the more I started to learn about it, the more I was drawn into it. Working on the firearms team, we had a lot of interaction with negotiators anyway, because a lot of firearms roles involve communication, negotiating with the subject behind the door with the firearm. So we often worked in tandem. So I kind of knew the people and I'd always been fascinated by this world. And yeah, so I applied. It took me a year to get onto it. The applications only came out in the autumn and I think we had the conversation in January. So it was a long process. And then I applied and I was successful in getting to the first stage. And the first stage is a very intense 2-week negotiation course where they literally strip you back, strip you down, make you work horrendous hours. And you come out the other side as a new developed person, I would say. And I was lucky enough to sit, I remember it clearly, to sit on that course and have an epiphany moment and go, this is what I want to do with not just my career, but my life. And this is what I want to be doing. I want to be one of you people here that trains other people to do it as well. And from that moment on, I just worked as hard as I could, getting myself involved as much as possible. Probably a lot of your listeners don't realise this, but actually in the UK, your police negotiators are part-time. So they have a full-time role anyway, and then they do it on top of their day job. So they could be attached to any squad or they could be 24-hour policing, and then they give up their free time to go and become negotiators. And there was a full-time unit at New Scotland Yard at the time with only 6 people on it, and I made it my goal to get on that unit. And 5 years later, I was successful, and then spent the next 6 years having an amazing experience, travelling the world, teaching negotiation, being involved in international negotiations, national negotiations. It was just a real privilege to share in hundreds of conversations, and 3 lessons I really learned from that were that loneliness is the biggest killer in the UK. It's very closely linked to suicide, loneliness, and that we all have some sort of crisis in our life at some stage, and that we all have a story.
As someone who helps put books together, I can second that 100%. Was that the kind of the thing then that you learned, that the crises that lead people to engage in dangerous situations that would need a negotiator, that loneliness is typically what underlies some of their actions?
Certainly for people in crisis who have reached the end of the line, who can't see a way forward, often they will become internalised. Often there are people who are lonely even though they're surrounded by people, because they don't feel that they can talk to other people, so they start to isolate themselves off. And so the problem or the challenge that they're having becomes bigger because they don't talk it through.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's also the fear of loss. I would say most crises, most hostage situations of some sort are because there is a fear involved, a fear of loss. So maybe the fear is loss of freedom going back to prison. Maybe it's the loss of a relationship. Maybe it's the loss of a job, can't afford the mortgage. The compounding effects that lead us into this turmoil and internalising dialogue that we have with ourselves, and then we can't see the clearer space in front of us.
Yeah, that's incredible, isn't it? For people who are going about their day-to-day lives still, so technically functional, but still feeling those types of things internally, do you think that that's common?
Yeah, I think it's probably more common than we realise, because what I found, I used to think I was a pretty good communicator and a pretty good listener until I went on the course, and then I realised that actually every conversation, more or less, is about me, what I believe to be true, and what I think is happening, because we make assumptions based on our values and belief systems and our experiences about what's going on for the other person. So sometimes we see people and their actions are not congruent with the words that they're saying. If you walk past somebody in the corridor, we have everyday conversations and we'll say, hey, how are you? How's it going? And sometimes we'll get a reply of, oh, it's okay, it's all right. And often we're so wrapped up in our own world, we move on from that conversation. If it's a close friend or family member that we know really well, we'll probably stop and go, hang on a sec, that doesn't sound quite right. Are you actually okay? But we've learnt, I feel, especially in UK culture, to put a brave face on it, to not worry about it, or not show that we're worried about it, and to move on, and then we wrap ourselves up in it, and then that's when it becomes harder and it becomes more of a crisis.
What should we all be more cognizant of when we're not necessarily seeing people like we used to be?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I was reading some research around people working from home, and that they found that people are working much longer hours because they don't have that structure, they don't have that lunchtime, that break, they don't have that time where they go to the kettle and put the kettle on and have a cup of coffee with somebody. So they're not having that human interaction. Yeah, they're having Zoom calls, they're interacting via Zoom, but we are social beings. I don't live on my own, I'm lucky in that respect, but there have been times during this lockdown when I have felt lonely, without a shadow of a doubt. And I know that people who do live on their own, they'll get up, they'll get on their Zoom calls, they'll do their Zoom meetings, they'll do their work, they'll eat into their evenings because you can't go out and have a drink after work or socialise with people. And they often don't see a real life human being unless they pop down to the shop to have that interaction. And talking to some of the older people in our community here, I live in a little village. When I left the police, I was so conscious of this loneliness factor that I never wanted anybody to be alone. So it's a long story, I'll cut it really short, but I ended up buying my local garage, converting the car showroom into a coffee shop and a gym, and having free amenities for the local community. Because I wanted to provide somewhere that they could come for whatever reason, whether it's to have a chat, book their car in, go to the gym, have a coffee, it doesn't matter. It just means that if they're on their own and they want some interaction, they can get it in any way, shape or form. And we ended up doing a delivery service to those people that were isolating and couldn't get out. And sometimes we were the only person they saw for 6 months, just dropping off their food.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And it's are you recognising the signs of people?
Yeah.
Can you have a chat with them offline rather than just constantly in these meetings? Are we checking in? Are we doing our normal, coffee and round the water cooler conversations just to make something normal? Are we spending time? Because often I think that, when we talk about negotiating with somebody in a crisis, yes, that's an extreme, a life-saving skill, but on the other end of the spectrum, it's about spending 2 to 5 minutes a day with somebody and just being present with them.
And isn't it sad that it's so easier said than done? Like 2 minutes is nothing, but in our busy life, I was saying this to someone the other day, with the lockdowns and everything and everyone having adjusted to an online life, like you say, more is getting packed into your day. You don't have 2 hours commute, you don't have lunch breaks, you don't have meeting breaks, and so, I'm finding it like 10-hour days, like going by in a flash and without even noticing. And yesterday I was logging my food. I started a new personal training thing recently, and I now log my food and send it to my trainer. And I did it last night, and I was just like, what did I have for lunch? And then I was like, oh yeah, I didn't, because I didn't take a lunch break, and I've forgotten to eat. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. So I think now we find ourselves in a situation where genuinely finding 2 minutes to just have a chat with a fellow human is hard. That's not a good place to be, is it?
It does. And this year I'll be really interested to see the stats at the end of this year. They normally get published at the beginning, sort of first quarter of the year after, but already it's showing that suicide rate is high. I mean, it's been a really tough year for people. Yeah. But again, we get so wrapped up in what's going on for us that sometimes it's harder to stop and just put the blinkers on and make a conscious effort in how we're communicating and how we're spending time with people.
Then do you have some advice or tips for people to make their business interactions just that little bit more meaningful and emotionally rooted?
I was thinking about this the other day because my partner is constantly on calls, and my sister is. There is no time for anything else. It's literally back-to-back calls. Now, I'm lucky. I have a bricks and mortar business which I can go down to and actually see real people and spend some real time. So perhaps factor in just 10-15 minutes before those calls to speak, especially if you're a team leader, speak individually to people. Or set time aside if you are working from home where you do have a break, that it becomes a natural part and that you leave your house and that you go out for the signs that something might not be quite right. Listen to the emotion that they're displaying. We give a lot away in how we talk and how we're expressing things, and perhaps they might seem, perhaps normally they're forthcoming with an idea, but at the moment they're not sharing experiences. Perhaps they seem distracted in the meeting. Perhaps they're not actually really in the meeting and they've just got their photograph up and they're doing loads of other stuff. It's easy to switch off. We're not very good at listening anyway, to be fair. We hear all these words and then make assumptions in our head about what the sentence will be, often finish off other people's sentences for them in our minds without really listening to what's going on, and get distracted. Gosh, we were so easily distracted from phones to, I stopped my Bluetooth on my watch because I was finding it was linked into my phone, and every time it vibrated on my wrist, I was like, oh, what's that?
Yeah.
Oh, what's that?
Yeah.
And that interferes with that being present with another person. And we've kind of lost that a little bit, I think. Yeah. We do it when somebody really needs us. I would always marvel at the fact I could go and spend 13, 14, 15 hours with a complete stranger who was in crisis and give of my whole self to them. But then I'd come home and I wouldn't even listen to my stepdaughter or my partner or what they were saying. I'd be just zoned out. I always find that interesting about how different relationships are. And actually, research has shown that a lot of our behaviour is based in child psychology anyway, but research has shown if we spend just 5 to 15 minutes a week with our child doing what they want to do without any distractions whatsoever, the behaviour of the child and the relationship of parent-child is so much stronger. It works with partners. If you try it, even if you just spend 5 minutes a day and really be with them, be present in their moment, share with them their day, don't say anything about yourself or how you're feeling, just make it all about them. Well, I will bet my mortgage that it will improve your relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's true, it's hard to get that focus, isn't it? And we all need it. It's not, I think sometimes it can be associated with childhood as well, and so as an adult it's often hard to command attention in the right way, isn't it? Or you don't feel like you should because that feels demanding, or and so if the other person doesn't volunteer their attention and you don't get that, then I can completely see how you could start living more and more in an internal world. No one's connecting with you, you kind of maybe don't have as much exposure to the action of connecting and may then find it harder to be the one to connect with others, perhaps.
Yeah, and that's really interesting what you mentioned there, because we're taught how to speak at school, from show and tell, from standing up in front of other people, but we're never taught how to listen, and we're not even really taught it unless we specialise as we get older. The things I learnt in adulthood, especially as I went through the negotiation course and then looking at human behaviour and experiencing and sharing with other people's stories, is that I wish I had learnt that at school. I wish I'd been taught that my emotions are so involved in the way that I behave and communicate, and actually I don't have to be that way. I can choose to. Yeah. I can choose to stop it. I can choose to pause it. but it takes conscious effort.
Yeah. You mentioned something as well a few minutes ago about sharing, that being at the crux of it. And as someone, again, who deals with words and people's messages, writing is just literally the physical, an example of sharing. Do you have more advice on sharing? And I mean in a day-to-day environment, like when someone says, "How are you?" and you go, "Fine." Do you know what I mean? Like how can we increase the quality of those like simpler interactions?
I call them tip of the iceberg conversations.
Okay.
So they're the cultural conversations that we have. We've been taught to say, "Hey, how are you?" and we have that little interaction before we talk about anything else. And it's interesting. There's a lady called Professor Liz Stokoe from Loughborough University who's done a lot of research on this. But when you don't have a conversation with that beginning, it feels awkward and it's weird. So, for example, if you get a text message or an email from somebody you don't really know very well, and it's almost halfway through the conversation, the temptation, I find, is to write back and go, "Yes, I'm very well, thank you. How are you today?" Now we can talk about...
It's so true.
So it's about being mindful of what people are showing you. I always say what you see. Say what you see, what's really going on for somebody. So if they say fine, why is it that they're using the word fine and not good? So, because if you're having a good day and somebody says, "Hey, how are you?" you'll go, "Yeah, I'm really good, thanks." If you say, "Yeah, I'm fine," that's immediately telling you that, okay, so you're saying fine. Now, it might just be that's the word that they use. But if it's not and something else is going on, you've missed an opportunity to grab that word and go, "What does fine mean for you?"
And that's interesting. Would that be the next question then? I think as Brits, there's almost, especially in that culture, there's an awkwardness, isn't there? Like, "Oh, okay, there might be something wrong. How do I don't want to cry."
Absolutely. And it depends who you're talking to, because it will depend on whether you know them, whether you feel comfortable about that, or whether you will just move on to the next conversation. But all you have to do is say what you see and just say, "Oh, I noticed you used the word fine there. Is everything okay?" That's all you have to say. And they might just go, "Oh, gosh, I didn't even realise I'd used that word. But no, everything's fine, thank you." You're unlikely to get an aggressive response by caring, I have found. Unlikely. And people will tell you. People will often say to me, when I was teaching negotiators to become negotiators, they would say, "Well, what do I say? What do I say to somebody who's standing on top of the building and looking like they're about to jump? Do I mention suicide? What happens if I put the thought of suicide into their head?" And I'm like, you won't put that thought into their head. If they're standing on top of the building, the wrong side of the railings, then something is not right here. So just say that. Just say, "We've been called because you're standing the wrong side of the railings on top of this building and it looks like you're going to jump." But we get so caught up, especially in our culture, of not having those open, honest conversations because we have all that fear dialogue going on of, "Oh, well, will I look stupid? I don't want to embarrass them. What if I'm wrong? How will they feel? What will they think of me?" And all that chit-chat going on there that overruns the actual, I'm just having a conversation with somebody and I'm just asking them if they're okay.
It's so simple. It's like, I hear you say that and I just think, oh God, when was the last time I asked somebody that? When was the last time I just took the extra 10 seconds to ask that one extra question? And, you just kind of rely on somebody giving you the answer to the question. I mean, you're absolutely right, because it's happened. I mean, I remember in my first year of business, I was living on my own at that time. The things that jumped out to me as being like, yeah, okay, I need to keep an eye on that. The first was I was living on my own and I was working all the hours because it's my first year in a new company and blah, 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 blah. And I went to the shop to get a coffee down the road and the lady at the checkout said, "How's your day today?" or something like that. And I said something really weird back, like, "Yes, you're welcome, thank you, you too." And it didn't make any sense. And then she looked at me and I was just like, "Oh, sorry." And then I was walking home, that was so odd. Why couldn't I handle that simple? And I realised I hadn't spoken in 3 days. I hadn't had any Zoom calls booked in, and I just had my head down and I had plans for the weekend with friends, so I hadn't really realised. And it was just so odd. Yeah, and that was the thing of don't let that happen again. Even if you can always finish work, you don't have to work into the evening. You'd be better off I would have been better off spending one of those evenings of the 3, finishing work like in a decent hour and spending 2 hours on the phone to a friend instead. But I had chosen not to, and without realising I was doing it. And I think, your book really lays it all out, and it gives people different methods for handling communication and in different scenarios. But it's written for our day-to-day experiences, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it shares some of the negotiations I've been involved in. It shares the lessons I've learned from them, because there is a lesson to learn from every single conversation.
Yeah.
But it's like everything in life, it's a skill, and we use it unconsciously so often that when we try and stop and use it consciously, it feels clunky and it feels weird. But the only way that we can change, and the only way we learn, is to stop and reflect on what's actually happened. And you can do that from every single conversation that you have. Even if you just spend 5-10 minutes a day doing it, thinking about, okay, what conversation have I had today and how did that go? And where did I project all my assumptions onto the conversation without actually checking in to see if I was right or wrong?
Yeah.
And you'll be surprised how I did it yesterday. I'd love to sit here, Georgia, and tell you I've nailed this and that it's amazing. I'm the best negotiator in the world. But I'm just not. Yesterday was a classic example of me making an assumption about how somebody else might be feeling with a member of my team, and then going away, getting all of that emotional internal dialogue, blow it out of proportion in my head, have a conversation in my head, stop and go, hang on, stop now, what's happening here? Okay, I get it. This is where I'm coming from, because I can only tell you where I'm coming from. I don't know where you're coming from, because I'm not you.
Yeah.
And now let's go back and have a clarification conversation and see what this was really all about.
And that's it, isn't it? Resisting the urge for a quick fix as well, because that's definitely habitual in our society, isn't it? It's kind of like, like you say, just taking a breath, taking the time to have that kind of conversation must make all the difference. As I say, cannot wait for the book to come out, and really urge everybody to go to the Communication Coach podcast and subscribe to that to hear more from Nicky on the matter. Nicky, where should people follow you as well to learn more about the book as it's due out in the next few months?
All right, lovely. Yes, so I'm on LinkedIn under Nicky Perfect. That is my real name, by the way. I haven't added a weird and wonderful surname. And I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram under Nicky Comms Coach.
Nicky Comms Coach. Lovely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us today, Nicky. And we'll speak very soon.
Thank you very much.